Do you have any urban myths in your country? And do you believe them? Today on this podcast, we're exploring some different urban myths and legends from around the world. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hello, and if you're a new listener to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And together with nearly 50 years of teaching English between us, Reza and I are going to help you improve your English and take your grammar, your vocabulary, your pronunciation, all aspects of your English up to the next level. How are you, Reza?
I'm doing pretty well, Craig. I'm excited because it's Fallas time in Valencia. So there's always a lot of people around, a lot of things happening, and fireworks all over the place. What about you?
I'm not that keen on Fallas, to be honest. After 25 years living here every year, it's a bit too much for me. But I like watching other people enjoy themselves, and I just hope that we can do this podcast without too many explosions and too much noise in the background. What are we speaking about this week, Reza?
Well, today we're speaking about a very popular idea. It's the idea of urban myths. I better spell that word, M-Y-T-H-S. And it's not easy to say. Myths.
Myths. And to begin this week, we're going to listen to a voice message we've received from Andres from Colombia.
Hey mates, this is Andres from Colombia. I know you hear this all the time, but I have to say thank you. Thank you very much for doing this, for all the effort and love you are putting into this. I have to confess, I'm not an alcoholic yet, but I'm in the process of becoming one of them. I've been listening to your podcast for the last 2 months, and I think it's entertaining and interesting as well. So keep doing it. And well, having said that, I want to suggest a topic, perhaps for a future episode. And the topic is urban legends. So we have this legend in Colombia and I think in other countries in South America and Central America. And the legend says, if you are bitten for this insect called machaca or mariposa caimán, something like alligator butterfly, if you are bitten for this insect, you have to have sex in the next 24 hours or you'll die. Very convenient, right? So that's all, guys. That's my suggest for you. Thank you very much again and have a nice day. Bye, mates.
Reza, have you heard of that urban legend, La Machaca or Mariposa Caimán? Is that familiar to you?
I hadn't heard of it until I heard Andres' message, and I must say I like the idea. I could see that being turned to my advantage.
Yep. To have sex in 24 hours or you die. It sounds like the Colombians are trying to increase their population. Maybe the government have released this urban legend to try and have more babies. What do you think?
It could be that, or it could be just people like me who have to resort to anything to achieve what they want in life.
We really liked your idea, Andres, so we're going to talk in this podcast about some other urban legends and myths from around the world. But before we do that, 1 or 2 comments about your message. First of all, thank you very much, Andres, for remembering to use the preposition to after listen. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know that somebody has donated €100 for a good meal for Reza and I at the end of the year. Although that can be reduced if you forget to use the preposition to. And I'm pleased to say that this tactic seems to be working. This strategy is bringing results because we are still at €100. Thank you, Andres. And it looks good for a nice meal at the end of the year.
Yes, thanks, Andres, for getting listened to correct. However, sorry to be a party pooper, aguafiestas. Speaking of prepositions, you did actually get another one wrong, but luckily we don't lose money for that.
Not yet.
Not yet,
Maybe
anyway.
next year.
You said if you get bitten for an insect, for, but it should be by, if you get bitten by, because to get bitten, that's passive. So when we say who's responsible for a passive verb, it's with the word by. So a book is written by someone. JFK Kennedy was assassinated by someone. So bitten by an insect.
And another very small thing, and I'm sure you know this, Andres, it was probably a very small slip, which was a slip of the tongue, but you confused the noun suggestion with the verb suggest. So suggest is the verb, so it should be my suggestion is blah, blah, blah. So what is an urban legend or a myth, Reza? We've just had one example from Andres, but could you define it so that people know exactly what we're talking about?
Yes, perhaps the word urban is a bit misleading. It doesn't really lead you to the true idea, because urban generally refers to cities, but urban legends and myths exist everywhere. I'm not exactly sure why we use the word urban, but what an urban legend or myth is a genre, a type of folklore, folk story, folk history, right? Comprising stories circulated as true. And typically you say that they happen to a friend of a friend. So not directly you or even your friend, but that friend's friend, friend of a friend or a family member. And usually something horrible, horrifying, maybe funny, or maybe a mixture of horrifying and funny seems to happen in the stories. So the story could happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be in an urban setting. So I'm not exactly sure why we do call them urban legends or myths, but that is the expression in English.
Okay, well, let's look at our first one. And the first example we have of an urban myth is very personal for me, and it's the spider bite. Now, we've used the word or the verb to bite already. Andres said to be bitten by something. And the urban myth or legend is that there are some tropical spiders that if they bite you, they can lay eggs or put their eggs under your skin. And over time, a large boil or lump develops under your skin. And suddenly when it bursts, hundreds and thousands of little baby spiders come out from under the skin. And I had a dream about this when I was very young, because I had a dog, not a real dog, it was a toy dog with a zip, and I used to keep my pajamas inside this dog when I was going to bed at night. Have I told you this story?
Yeah, I know it, but
So-
I think the listeners are going to like it.
So maybe I haven't told it on the podcast before. This is true. And every night I used to take my pajamas out of this black dog and get dressed and go to bed. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. Well, one night I opened the zip of this dog to take out my pajamas, and this big black spider crawled out of the dog. And I screamed and I cried, and my dad came in the room and he killed the spider. But during the night, I woke up and there were lots of little spiders in the bed. And ever since that night, I have a phobia of spiders. I hate spiders. So that actually happened, but the spiders were not under my skin. The spiders were probably in the pajama case in the dog, and they came out into the bed somehow. Or maybe in the pajamas. They were in the pajamas and they were crawling on my body. However, this is not possible. This idea that the spider can lay eggs under your skin and they hatch, which means they come out of your skin, it's not actually possible, but it does appear in many horror books and films. For example, there's a similar idea in the Alien series, where the monster comes out of the chest, and there's another film called The Wrath of Khan, and another one called The Host. and a very famous book and film. Stephen King wrote Dreamcatcher, which has a similar idea in it. So it's been made popular by books and films, and that's why it's become an urban myth or an urban story.
Let's move on to our next urban myth or urban legend or story, the Slender Man. Well, first, I better explain the word slender. If a person is slender, that's S-L-E-N-D-E-R, it's an adjective which means they're slim, they're not fat, and they can move around easily because they're nice and slim.
It's quite
agile.
positive, isn't it?
It's a positive thing. Yeah, to say someone is slender, they wouldn't be upset. But to call them the Slender Man, they would. Because the Slender Man is a modern myth that started online as part of a competition to Photoshop pictures and to try and include some kind of supernatural element. So supernatural means something which cannot be explained from what we know about nature, but it seems to exist. It's supernatural. So this Slender Man character always seems to wear a black suit and tie and has a white, featureless face. You can't really see any nose or eyes or mouth, or not clearly. The features aren't clear. So he's got this featureless face, and he's often seen in the shadows, the dark part of the photos, and very creepily stalking small children. To stalk is to kind of, in a hidden way, follow someone without them knowing, or keeping your distance so you never quite catch up with them, but you're always behind them. So kind of stalking small children. So very sinister. And some say that he can drive you insane. You go crazy with the terror of this kind of featureless, horrible character always stalking you. Apparently, he was first seen at a hospital for the mentally ill. So that kind of adds a little bit of freakiness to it. So there was a bloody rampage, R-A-M-P-A-G-E. A rampage is when lots of people run all over the place in the hospital. And afterwards, a photo showed him hiding under the stairs while the chaos was going around all over the place, erupting. People didn't know what to do because of the Slender Man, and he was just there kind of enjoying the chaos. And since then, Slender Man has gone viral, so it's all over the internet, and millions of authors, mostly online, have shared and spread the story of Slender Man. And his MO, his modus operandi, the way he seems to operate, according to the urban myths we know, is that he kidnaps people, often children. Well, what do you think, Craig?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this until we researched the information for this podcast episode, and that sounds really creepy. And even though you know it's something that's gone viral on the internet because of these photoshopped pictures and photographs, it's still a bit sinister, a bit creepy. And you look for photos, you look for the man in the background who's looking for children and following children around in a really negative way. So yeah, quite scary. Our next urban myth focuses on hands. Now, we all have hands at the end of our arms, but these hands are hairy. And we have hair on our heads and on our chests sometimes and other places in our body, but these hands are very, very hairy. Hairy is the adjective to describe the hands. So what are these hairy hands? Well, the story goes that on an isolated stretch of road or piece of road in Dartmoor, which is a place in the south of England, a very desolate place, late at night, many people have reported a pair of hairy hands suddenly appearing from nowhere and grabbing or taking by force the steering wheel of their car, or maybe the handlebars of their motorbike. Now, the steering wheel is how you change direction. It's the wheel that changes the direction of the car. And the handlebars do the same thing on a motorbike or a bicycle. So these hairy hands take control of the vehicle and they try to change the direction and steer the victim to crash off the road. Apparently, this legend goes back to 1921 when a worker at the famous or infamous is famous in a negative way, the infamously desolate Dartmoor prison, which is a prison in the UK in the middle of nowhere. It's very remote. A worker at this prison had this experience where the hairy hands took control of his motorbike handlebars. And he was travelling with his children at the time, and they were in a sidecar, which is a small way of travelling next to a motorbike. It attaches to the motorbike. It's called a sidecar. And luckily, the kids managed to jump to safety, but unfortunately, the man was killed. This prison worker was killed. So that's the story of the hairy hands. Have you heard of those, Reza?
Yes, I had heard of those because I lived not that far from Dartmoor. I didn't actually live in Dartmoor, hardly anybody does, but I lived about kind of 45 minutes to an hour's drive from Dartmoor. So I had heard of the story. Everybody in that part of England, the southwest of England, knows that story. And a lot of people all over Britain, in fact, know the story. And I can tell you that the area, Dartmoor, is very desolate. It really feels very isolated. So the idea that hands would appear kind of late at night there, that would shock anybody, because you imagine there's nobody from miles around if you're driving near Dartmoor. I should explain that a moor is a kind of a barren, that's B-A-R-R-E-N, barren. Not much grows there. It's very desolate. It's very open space. It's going to be cold at night. It's going to be damp. It'll get frozen over in the winter. It's the type of place you don't want to be late at night. And you want to be there even less if a pair of hairy hands is going to suddenly appear, right?
Now, is it possible that these hairy hands might have been invented for the police if someone was driving home a little drunk from the pub and crashed the car?
That's a thought. You could be onto something there. That's
Maybe.
not a bad idea.
Yeah, it wasn't me, officer. It was the hairy hands of Dartmoor that crashed the car, not the 5 pints of beer I drank. What's the next one, Reza? Now, there's a Blue Yeti behind you on the shelf there. Have you heard of a Blue Yeti? It's a microphone.
Oh, wow.
But we're not talking about microphones here, are we?
No, we're not talking about microphones at all. Far less technological than that. The Yeti, Y-E-T-I, the Yeti, or also called the Abominable Snowman. That's quite a funny expression, isn't it?
It's a difficult word to say, abominable.
Abominable means like really horrible, terrible, just unbearable, right? So this abominable snowman, you can't bear him, you can't tolerate him, he's horrible. But it sounds a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it? I mean, these days, if you were to say something was abominable, people might chuckle a bit. They might laugh. It's a slightly old-fashioned word. Like, what was the concert like you went to the other day? Oh, it was abominable. People would think that you'd traveled back in time about 60 years.
It's not very common, but it does collocate rather well with snowman. That's quite a popular collocation.
For some reason, it's stuck. So it's the Yeti or the abominable snowman.
Abomination is quite common.
Yes, as the noun, that's true.
The noun. It's an abomination.
Yeah.
Terrible thing you've done. An abomination.
So this character, the Yeti or the abominable snowman, is said to roam. You maybe know the word roam from roaming on your mobile phone, on your smartphone. If you got roaming activated, you can travel to different countries and use your phone as if you were still in your own country. So to roam is to move around. So this Yeti roams the Himalayas, the mountains. It's a character that was first mentioned by the Sherpa people. The Sherpa people are the local indigenous people who live in the Himalayas. And their description of him is as, and I'll quote, an enormous, shaggy, like lots of hair, not very well kept, all over the place. An enormous shaggy ape man, so an ape like a big monkey, yeah, with huge feet and aggressive saber-like teeth. So a saber is a type of sword, so very sharp, long teeth. And it's said to get up to as much as 6 feet tall. That's pretty tall human. And produce footprints when it walks of around 13 inches long. So pretty big feet.
And speaking of big feet, now some people say that North Americans like to do things bigger and better than anywhere else. Well, you might not be surprised to know that there is a North American version of the Yeti called Bigfoot. And of course, Bigfoot has big feet. He's been called a ferocious beast who attacks loggers and hikers. Now, a logger is a person who works in the forest and cuts down trees. When you cut down a tree and you cut off all the branches and leaves of the tree, then you have a big, cylindrical, huge piece of wood that becomes a log. And a person who cuts down trees and creates these logs are called loggers. So loggers are people hiking, walking in the forest. So he could be called a ferocious beast who attacks loggers and hikers, or he could be called a gentle giant who just wants to be left alone. Of course, that's depending on your perception of a monster, because maybe you have empathy and sympathy for Dracula and Frankenstein. They have their vulnerabilities, and some films have portrayed them or showed them as, you have sympathy for these monsters. So it depends how you think of this Bigfoot. And the legend of Bigfoot began back in 1958 when a journalist called Andrew Genzoli published a letter from a reader of the paper he worked at. And in this letter, it detailed mysteriously large footprints that these loggers in Northern California had found. And Genzoli in the newspaper said, maybe we have a relative of the abominable snowman of the Himalayas. And that's according to the website history.com. Now, this Bigfoot, you can hopefully, if you go looking, allegedly see him in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I'm sure you've heard of Bigfoot, Reza.
Yes. I think pretty much everybody in native English-speaking countries has heard of Bigfoot.
Yeah, and the Yeti too.
And the Yeti, or the abominable snowman. I wonder if Bigfoot is as abominable as the Yeti. Do you reckon he is?
I'd like to see them in a fight, actually. Wouldn't it be interesting if they were in a boxing ring and they were fighting it out? I wonder who'd win.
I think you've just given an idea to a B-movie director. Yeti versus Bigfoot.
Turn up the heating and the snow, and the Yeti will melt if he's made of snow.
The director who made films like Sharknado or something like that might be onto that.
So Bigfoot would obviously have an axe because of the loggers. I wonder what weapon the Yeti would have.
Well, you've been on holiday in Nepal, haven't you?
Yeah.
Which is not far from there. There are Sherpa people in Nepal, aren't there?
There are. Maybe he'd have like a spear or a sword to fight with, perhaps.
Is that the sort of thing people use there?
I'm guessing. I'm not sure. I didn't see any Yetis while I was there. In fact, Sherpas are quite small, quite short. They're not very big, imposing people. They're very strong, but they're not very tall or big.
Did you hear about the man who waited patiently to see the abominable snowman?
I can feel a joke coming. What happened?
He waited very patiently, but he hasn't seen one Yeti.
Oh.
Not Yeti.
Not Yeti. That's terrible, Reza. Let's move to another part of the world now. Reza, tell us about al-Dwais.
Well, I didn't know about this one till I did a bit of research, but it's fascinating. al-Dwais, that's as good as my pronunciation can be. Forgive me if I haven't said it well. is a character that you'll hear people talking about in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So it's a Middle Eastern urban myth. And the citizens there are afraid of what they call the jinn.
Gin and tonic.
No, gin and tonic.
A different spirit.
Although, yeah, a different type of spirit. Although some people probably are a bit afraid of gin and tonic in
it's a Muslim country.
You're not supposed to drink.
Yeah.
But no, we're talking about J-I-N-N, gin.
Or sometimes spelt with a D, D-J-I-N-N.
Ah, okay.
Sometimes.
And our English version, and indeed the Spanish version of this idea, gets transformed into a genie. So G-E-N-I-E, and genie is like a spirit. In the typical cliches of genies, they appear from a bottle, right? You rub the bottle, you make a wish, and boom, the magic genie appears. So some kind of spirit. So we get the word genie from gin.
Did you hear about the Irishman who found a bottle and there was a genie inside?
No.
He opened the bottle, the genie came out. The genie said, "You have 3 wishes. What's your first wish?" And the Irishman says, "I'll have a pint of Guinness that refills itself, that's never empty, that fills up again with Guinness." And there was a big puff of smoke, and there was a pint of Guinness, and the Irishman drank it, and it filled up with Guinness, and he drank it again, and it filled up with Guinness, and he drank it again, and he filled up with Guinness. He said, "That's fantastic." And the genie says, "Okay, you have 2 more wishes." What did the Irishman say?
What was the second wish?
The second and the third. "Can I have 2 more of those?"
Oh, really?
"I'll have 2 more of those, please."
But anyway, back to our gin, not gin and tonic, but our genie gin, Al Dwais of UAE. So, as I said, the word genie comes from gin. Gins can be good, like the ones that you find when you rub a bottle and they give you 3 wishes. That's good, right? But jinn or genie, they can also be bad in Middle Eastern culture. And the Al Dwais jinn is one of the most famous in that part of the world. And she, so it's a female character, she was even immortalized in a film in 2013.
It was called Jinn, the name of the film.
Called Jinn. Mm-hmm. And her story is pretty simple. At first, she appears as a beautiful woman to attract men. But as soon as she's reeled them in, so to reel something in is like when you catch a fish when you're fishing. Yeah, on your fishing line, then you got to turn around the handle and reel it in because the fish is out there in the water and you have to bring the fish over to you standing on the bank. So you reel it in, you bring it over. So she attracts them in, she like hooks them with her looks. And then when she's reeled them in, she changes into a terrifying figure who eats the men that she's enchanted. So first she fools them, and then when they've fallen for a trick, she's got them and she eats them.
I've known 1 or 2 women like that in my time, particularly one from France that I remember a few years ago who changed after we were in the relationship. She didn't eat me, but she was very nasty at the end.
Maybe she nearly ate you, Craig. You know the expression, once bitten, twice shy.
Yeah.
Were you bitten a bit? Yeah.
Yeah, I was bitten at the end quite badly, but that's a story for another podcast.
Once bitten, twice shy means once you've been bitten, in other words, once something bad has happened to you, you're twice shy, you're doubly shy, you're extra cautious. You don't want it to happen again. So maybe Craig was bitten, so to speak, by his genie, and now he's a little bit more cautious.
Yeah, a beautiful woman who you're attracted to and then after time changes into a terrifying figure who eats you.
Craig, I believe the next character is yet another woman who brings bad luck.
Yes, a banshee. The Banshees, Banshees. By the way, if you are interested in these legends and you want to read more, you can find short summaries on the website at inglespodcast.com/408 for this episode. So what's a banshee? Well, it's from the Irish bean stee. Did I pronounce that properly? Probably not.
I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling it's probably Bien Shide.
Bien Shide.
Something like that.
It translates to woman of the fairies. And a fairy, if you are a Spanish speaker, is hada, so a fairy, a woman of the fairies. And a banshee was or is a supernatural being. There's that word supernatural again, superordinary, from Celtic folklore. And it's said that whoever hears her mournful wailing at night is soon to die. He's going to die soon. But what is mournful wailing? Well, if you wail, W-A-I-L, it's kind of like when you're very, very sad or you're in pain emotionally, there's a sound you make that's like, because you're really emotionally damaged inside. And mournful, the adjective, there's a verb to mourn, M-O-U-R-N, which is very common when someone dies, someone you're close to dies and passes on. Then you mourn that person. You feel very sad for a time period. And you can also say you're in mourning for someone if you lose someone that's close to you. So mournful is the adjective, and the mournful wailing is that horrible sound that people can make when they're emotionally very, very, very much in pain. But don't worry. If you're only on holiday in Ireland, it's believed that they only forewarn people of pure Irish descent of their imminent doom. What does that mean? Well, only if you're Irish will you be affected by the banshees. So if you're a tourist, you'll probably be okay. Is that right to say, Reza?
Well, you needn't worry about hearing a banshee. Or maybe you should. If you're an Italian and you're there and you hear the banshee, maybe it turns out you're actually Irish. But you haven't got much time to worry because you're going to die soon. No. So if you're on holidays, you needn't worry because in theory you wouldn't be able to hear it. Only the person who's going to die hears the banshee. And you don't die immediately, but it means you're going to die soon.
And if you want to see some musical mournful wailing, just go to YouTube and search for Siouxsie and the Banshees, which was a very popular punk group that were really in pop culture back in the 80s. Siouxsie and the Banshees.
The next one is one that I'm sure some of our listeners already have heard of. That is the chupacabra. So even when we talk about this urban myth or legend in English, we say chupacabra. I guess we could say the goat sucker, but we don't. We keep it in the original because chupar is suck and cabra is goat, but we don't. We say it in the original Spanish, chupacabra. Now, this chupacabra figure is first believed to have appeared as a kind of vampiric, like a vampire, reptilian, like a reptile kind of creature. And it's called chupacabra because it drains goats and other small animals of their blood.
What does drain mean?
To drain is when you slowly take away liquid from somewhere, or it slowly disappears. It drains away. So this chupacabra drains the blood by drinking it from goats and other animals. That's where it gets the name from. So this goat sucker, this chupacabra, it was first reported as being seen in March 1995. So it's a fairly recent urban myth. And that story took place in Puerto Rico, when 8 sheep were found dead and drained of the blood. And they had 3 small puncture wounds in their chest. Now, to puncture, P-U-N-C-T-U-R-E, or a puncture, it can be a noun or a verb. To puncture is to make a small hole in something. And a wound is whenever you've been injured what you have then is a wound, W-O-U-N-D. So this chupacabra supposedly punctured the chests of these 8 sheep to drink their blood.
Like Dracula, really?
Yeah. So a bit like a vampire. But we imagine it as some kind of animal rather than a vampire, which is more or less human, but, the big teeth and just happens to be immortal. And 5 months after this story, as many as about 150 farm animals were all found killed in the same way, the puncture wounds and the blood drained from them. So is that just a coincidence? Who knows? But more alleged sightings, that means alleged, people say it happened, but that doesn't mean for sure that it really did happen. It's alleged. So alleged sightings followed all over Latin America and the southern United States. Well, even the north of the United States, right up in Maine, which is right up in the northeast, a sighting was even reported. And in the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, the chupacabra reemerged, but this time it tended to be described in a different way. It was described as hairless, a dog-like animal, so looked like a dog, walking on 4 legs, quite horrific looking, hairless, no hair, and with a gaunt expression, G-A-U-N-T, gaunt. Gaunt means tired, thin, muscle has wasted away, that kind of look. And also burnt-looking skin, burnt by fire in some way. That was the most recent description of a supposed sighting of the chupacabra.
I hadn't heard of that at all. I did a little bit more research, and one explanation could be that there were some wild dogs that had a disease which caused their fur, or the hair of the dogs, to fall out, which accounts for or explains their appearance. And maybe the animals and sheep were killed by wolves, drank the blood. So, yeah, I don't know. But interesting legend. So do you know any urban legends or myths from your country that we haven't talked about here on this podcast? If so, Reza and I would love to hear from you. So why not send us a voice message and tell us about the urban myth in your country? You can do that by going to speakpipe.com. That's our preferred way of receiving messages. So speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Reza, how can people reach us by email?
If you want to write to us, you could write to Craig. You'll find him at Craig at is a robber, right? Craig at inglespodcast.com, or me, belfastreza at gmail.com.
You also might be interested in buying some courses to help you with your English. If you are, then for more information, go to the Mansion Ingles website. That's store.mansioningles.net.
As always, we'd like to thank all of you who are helping us by supporting the podcast through the Patreon scheme. That's Patreon. And this Patreon program allows you, if you want, to donate as little as $1.20 per month. And for people who donate that money, as a thank you, they get instant access to recent audio transcriptions.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to mention everybody who is signed up already to the Patreon program, but we would like to say hi, thank you to the latest person who has signed up, and that is Mar Martin Moreno. Thank you very much to you, Mar, and to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon. Reza, what's next week?
Next week we've got Australian English.
Sounds good to me, mate. Looking forward to speaking in a very ineffective Australian accent next week. I'll have to practice that, I think. So until next time, thank you very much for joining us.
Bye-bye from me.
And it's bye-bye from me. Take care, and we'll see you on next week's podcast. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.